So just to remind you, when it comes to apologetics, the goal is, well, the point is to get people to see Jesus. I mean, that's really when I think of apologetics, I think of it as brush clearing. Oftentimes we can think that these issues are heady, intellectual, and not meeting people where they are, but sometimes it really is the case that there are intellectual obstacles or some sort of these, even if they're in the guise of intellectual obstacles, that are standing between them and the Lord. And I view apologetics as clearing that brush so that people can get to Jesus. So it really is it's ultimately about people and about one particular person, or three persons. but it is about Jesus. And I will, the next two talks, they're going to be a little heavier. I mean, because we're going to be talking about sin, we're going to be talking about suffering, and I don't want you to think that as we go, I'm not telling you how to minister to your people, to your flocks. That's not what I'm doing. I'm giving you some tools, at least in some of this you may already know. I just want you to be able to have some of the background so that you can clear the brush and then minister to those people. You know, certainly when someone's going through pain, you don't say, well, you know what, there's the logical problem of evil. Let me tell you about that, how there really isn't a logical contradiction. That means absolutely nothing for people who are suffering. So keep that in mind. It's going to be very personal, and we're going to end in the next session where I'm going to say that there is no objective morality. I'm saying that a little bit provocatively. And you're going to say, when I explain it, you'll say, okay, that makes sense. But morality is subjective, and it's based in persons, and particularly in one person. Okay, so this is where we are going to get more personal here. This problem of evil, I mean, it's not like I have to say, hey, do you realize that this world is a wreck? Just in case you didn't know that, I'm here to tell you that there's a problem. You already know that. I want to start with a quotation or a little passage from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and it's a little disturbing. And I'll say I read that this is a passage, one of the central parts in the Brothers K, where Ivan he's struggling with the problem of evil, and this is a genuine problem, as you know, and it is going to be a little dark. So here's what Ivan says. People speak sometimes about the animal cruelty of man, but that is terribly unjust and offensive to animals. No animal could ever be so cruel as a man, so artfully, so artistically cruel. These Turks, among other things, have also taken delight in torturing children, starting with cutting them out of their mother's womb with a dagger and ending with tossing nursing infants up in the air and catching them on their bayonets before their mother's eyes. The main delight comes from doing it before their mother's eyes. But there's a picture that I found very interesting, and notice Ivan is struggling here. You know, this is something that this isn't just a little thing. But there's a picture that I found very interesting. Imagine a nursing infant in the arms of its trembling mother, surrounded by Turks. They've thought up an amusing trick. They fondle the baby. They laugh to make it laugh, and they succeed. The baby laughs. At that moment, a Turk aims a pistol at it, 4 inches from its face. The baby laughs gleefully, reaches out its little hands to grab the pistol, and suddenly the artist pulls the trigger right in its face and shatters its little head. Artistic, isn't it? By the way, they say that the Turks are very fond of sweets. This is one of the things that it's much different to point someone to evil than it is to talk about it. You know, when we see it on the news or we hear something like this, we're not really just saying, oh, you know, there's a lot of suffering. We see a specific case, a specific example, and that pierces us. And you know that this is just one, much worse things happen than this. Countless times over. My brother is in the States, he's an FBI agent. And one of the parts of training FBI agents is they have to go through a desensitization training. So they stick them in a room and they show them images and videos of some of the most horrific things. My brother said particularly the men with children are just overwhelmed. But it's not a torture. You would think, well, that's just torture. Well, what they don't want them, obviously they don't want the FBI agents. They're going to see things like this, and they can't just collapse when they see it. People are in help, and they need to act, so they have to be desensitized. But I had to tell my brother, I just said, well, they showed that. Okay, that's enough. So how to deal with this? One of the questions I ask my students, I'll read this passage to them. We have at New St. Andrews, the college that I teach at, we have oral exams at the end of each term, where we just have a one-on-one exam in our office, and we talk. And I'll read this passage, and then I'll say to them, this is in my Apologetics course, and I ask them, where was your God? And they have to answer. And it's one thing to say intellectually, but after having that read to them and then saying that, that's a different matter. Now, of course, I've trained, it's not like I'm catching them off guard. We've talked about this so that it's more of a test to see if and they do a great job, and I'm always so proud of them for how they respond under that kind of pressure. But it is pressure nonetheless. So now this problem, it's often called the problem of evil, it's ancient, it's well known. You've certainly engaged with it yourself. But just to go over it quickly, it's said that there's something, the problem is this: given a God of a certain kind, the certain kind particularly that you Christians believe in, that seems contradictory to this kind of evil occurring, this kind of suffering. And the reason, and there's three attributes of God that people point to. First is that, well, God is all-powerful. So he has the ability to control the world. He could stop evil if he wanted to. Then notice that last part, if he wanted to. Well, he's good. He's all good. Therefore, he would want to stop evil. Think of you as parents. You would want to intervene when your child is in some sort of grave danger. And if you, being evil, want to do that, how much more your Father in heaven would want to do that. The other thing, too, is the third attribute is that none of this escapes his gaze. He knows all of the evil that's happening. So he's not like, yeah, I would have stopped that. I mean, I could have if I had known about it, but I didn't know about it. Well, that's not a possibility for God, a God who is all-knowing. So here's the problem. You have a God who has these three attributes, and it doesn't seem like this can go with this. There's a disconnect here, and it's a logical one. It's one that it's a contradiction. It's almost like square, circle. And what people will do, and this is the intellectual problem of evil, where people where an atheist, and even, I mean, I don't know anyone who hasn't at least thought of this at some, Christian or not, who said, yeah, that does seem, there's something incongruent here. So, and if there's a logical contradiction, then of course there is no God, because we're certainly not going to deny this. At least most of us in the West. I mean, we're not saying that all suffering is just something that it's an illusion. There's genuine suffering. So if one of these has to go, it's this. So that's the problem. That's the problem, and we're not going to take away any of these for God. Now, someone might. I mean, there are people who will take away. There are different movements in Christianity where they'll try to take away certain things. Take away the sovereignty of God or whatever it is, and that he can't help that. But we're not going to do that. I'm going to assume that God is characterized by these three. Now, of course, this is more of an aside to this problem, but in another sense, it's not an aside. What's the problem here? What caused this? Well, you did. I did. I think this was G.K. Chesterton. Someone said, what is wrong with the world? Someone wrote in a paper, and he wrote back, "Dear Sir, I am sincerely G.K. Chesterton," or something like that. But that really is, we carry the problems with us. We are at fault here. This problem of evil, this problem of suffering, is linked obviously to this problem of sin, which is the solution is the gospel. It's Jesus. So this is not just a bothersome problem. It's also a great opportunity to point to the Lord's work and to point to God's graciousness and his love for us. So there's a glass half full aspect to this as well. And I want you to keep that in mind. So the problem is sin, the problem is you, and I want us to just also keep in mind, again, you know this, that the sin is a type of insanity that runs so deep that, as we're, even us, as we're getting together, we're talking, we enjoy one another's company, and it's just a lovely time. And we are nice to one another. We love one another. But the person sitting across from you is still a sinner. No matter how nice, there's still something desperately wrong. Now, of course, we're getting better. Through the process of sanctification, judicially, we're okay. But even when it comes to sanctification, we're in a process. This is not a little thing. We can sometimes sweep it under the rug, but we really are all very sick still. Now, why would God allow this? Basically, another way of saying this is, how do you reconcile these two? A God of this character with suffering of this horrific extent. Why would God allow this? Well, the short answer is, we don't know. We don't know. However, just the fact that we don't know doesn't mean that these cannot fit together. Think of it this way. Okay, so imagine, here's the argument. If you did say, you know what, I cannot think of any reason for this, take any instance of sin, any instance of horrific suffering, and it's so difficult. I can't think of any reason that God would allow this. Any specific reason. Therefore, God doesn't have a reason for allowing this. Now, is that really a good argument? Remember the type of God that that we were dealing with initially. A God who's all powerful, all good, and all knowing. Now, when we say something like, you know what, or we make that inference from, for the life of me, I cannot see a reason why God would allow this. Therefore, he has no reason. What we're saying is, you know what? I've plumbed the depths of God's infinite wisdom and knowledge, and I've looked around and I've seen he has no reason. We tend to we underestimate God when we're, obviously, and that's an understatement. When we're saying God is all-knowing, he knows everything that there could be. It's not just that he's really, really smart. It's as if his knowledge is infinite. And I go through, in one of my courses, I talk about the mathematical properties of infinity, so that the students can understand that we really don't have a good grasp on infinity. It messes with our intuitions. We're not good at our intuitions about infinity. So therefore, analogously, we're not all that good about our intuitions about God. God would do this. You know, if I were God, I certainly wouldn't have trusted my words to an ancient race that's running around the desert in the ancient Near East. Yeah, I would have done something a little more sophisticated. So what? So who cares what I think? Really, so our expectations about what God can do we're so poor. I mean, this is why we have to cling to Scripture. He tells us what he's like. It's hard for us to get. So my point here is he knows so much, and to give that kind of answer, that because I can't figure out a reason, that there is no reason, therefore these can't go together, therefore there's no God, is a really, really bad argument. So intellectually, there's very little going for this. As much as we make of this intellectual problem, of the problem of evil, it's the Achilles heel of theism or Christianity, it's remarkably weak in certain forms. But notice when I read that passage from from Dostoevsky, that's much more powerful. So you can see how there's much more of an existential issue here when it comes to the problem of evil. That's not to say that there aren't intellectual problems when it comes to this. But certainly the fact that we can't figure out what God's doing means that he's got no idea what he's doing. That's a bad argument. There is more that we can say than that. There's more that we can say than just, well, that's a bad argument. We actually have positive reasons for thinking that God will use suffering for good. So, the Bible gives examples of this that you're familiar with. Job is a perfect example. He's gone through all kinds of horrific suffering, and he's upright. He's a good man. And yet all this is happening to him. It makes no sense. It makes no sense to him, to his buddies, who make the problem worse. So what does God do? Does he say this? You know what, Job? Let me put your mind at ease. Let me tell you why I'm allowing you to suffer. Let me give you some of the reasons so that you can actually make sense of it. And that's not what he says. That's not what he says at all. Listen to this. He says, so in chapter 38, then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm, and he said, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. If God said that to me, I'd be nervous. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and the angels shouted for joy? Surely you know, for you were already born. You've lived so many years. So Job so this is a subtle hint from God. Oh, so you know all of my reasons. Because you can't figure it out, you know that you're perplexed. You know that you think there must not be some good reason. Let me ask you a little bit about, I don't know, just the physical realm. You know, how much do you know about that? Oh, not a lot. And yet here you are judging, or at least being tempted to judge me, as if, again, it's this, we really ought not to expect to know God's thoughts. I mean, other than insofar as he reveals them to us and insofar as we can figure out his character from his word. And so, Job, what a great response. Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. So it goes back to what we would expect. What would we expect? Would we be the first? Would we expect that God would tell us that he would have good reasons, and we'd be the first to know about them? This notion of expectation, and this is one of the things that I try to emphasize with my students. We have these expectations of what God would do, and they're really expectations of what we would do if we were God, which are totally different from what God would do, oftentimes. There's a case that Alvin Plantinga has to get this. It's an example, an illustration that helps us to see this. I mean, it's called the no-seum argument. No-seums are these tiny little bugs in the U.S. You might have them here. They're really tiny, so they're hard to see, and yet they can bite and cause pain that's all out of proportion with their size. So you have these no-seums. Imagine I come into this room and you ask me, are there any no-seums in here? I just poke my head in and I go, no. Now, you should be a little bit suspicious about that because you wouldn't expect me to see them. Now, what if you said, hey, is there a St. Bernard in that room? Now I look in this room and I look for a St. Bernard and I don't see one and I say no. Well, you could be a little more confident that there isn't a St. Bernard. Well, looking for reasons for God allowing this suffering is much more like looking for no-seums. We ought not to expect necessarily that we can plumb a vastness that great. So we ought not expect to know, but we can say even more. We can even see positive examples where God will actually, he's not just withholding knowledge from us, he actually shows us that he does use bad things for good. So we know he does that sometimes and actually tells us that he's doing it, that he's drawing straight with these crooked lines. So think to the story of Joseph, right? After all that, Joseph, certainly not this cocky little kid, has a big mouth on him, and it's not like he was entirely innocent, but it was a little overboard to first think, oh, let's kill him, and no, let's just sell him to. I mean, that was a little extreme. Turns out he goes through the story, all kinds of suffering, and then when his brothers find out after that, and their dad is about to die, they're like, uh-oh, now that the dad's going to die, he's going to unleash some serious pain on us now, because dad's not around to kind of keep that in check. Remember what Joseph said. He said, am I in the place of God? Now, true, you meant all of this for evil, but God meant it for good, for the saving of many lives. So there you go. There's at least one, and you could probably think of more, there's at least one case of God using something horrible. And if you don't think it's horrible, put yourself in, think about asking Joseph how he enjoyed it all. There's this horrific chain of events, and God's using it for good, and he tells us he's doing it. So we get the back of the book answers, thankfully enough. And oftentimes we don't have that. We can't see behind the veil. We can't see the theory, the explanation behind the observations. But when God tells us, what a great gift. So we know, now we might not be, and most of the time we probably can't know why specifically this horrific thing happened, or this amount of suffering occurred. We can't say, you know what, because I know why this baby was born with all of these defects. Well, no, you don't. But at least you have something to hold on to that, look, God does use that for good. At least he can, because he has. And he tells us that he does. Okay, but there are other problems. Why create creatures who sin in the first place? We could have avoided a lot of trouble. Just create some better creatures. Just start with some better material. There's a number of responses to it. Here's one response. Okay, perhaps. But what about this? Maybe, now we're going to be talking about choosing and freedom. So if you're a Calvinist, I want you to bite your tongue and just hold on for a second. But free will is something that we do not understand. So this is one of the things that Calvinists can overstep their knowledge when it comes to free will and choice, and we don't have a handle on that. But perhaps here's one consideration. Imagine that God wants to create beings who can love him. This is called the free will defense. Creatures that can love him. Well, by nature, freedom, by definition, he couldn't force us and put us in a position where we're forced to choose him rather than choosing ourselves. That would be coercion, and that wouldn't be freedom. And what kind of love would that be? Think about you with your spouse. Okay. It's kind of like Beauty and the Beast. When Belle was in the tower with the Beast. Now, this is probably a bad example because Belle ends up falling in love with the Beast. But you have this coercion where Belle is stuck. That's not a way to, and most of us don't have to worry about this, but that's not the way to woo a woman. Unless you're a Benjamite, maybe. So you have you don't want to coerce. So maybe by definition, God he created us so that we could choose to love him. I know all the alarms are going off in your head if you're a Calvinist. Remember, there's a mystery here. Let's say that's true. Let's say that's a decent answer, a decent response. That still doesn't answer this question. Where did this desire to rebel come from in the first place? So the question that we just answered was, given that there's this desire, why didn't God stop it? Why didn't he just go, whoa, 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 whoa? I mean, just like you would a toddler, you redirect them and you keep them from sin. You keep them from hitting their sibling. But what about the desire itself, the desire to sin? Where'd that come from? Again, we don't know. But it's not as if we can't say anything. Here's a hypothesis. Notice what we're doing. We're doing theology here. I'm coming up with a hypothesis, a theory. I mean, I didn't come up with this, but someone has come up with this. Augustine. You're familiar with a man named Augustine, right? He came up with something like this. So don't get mad at me. What if, in order to, I'll fill it out for him though. What if, in order to enter into a relationship with creatures, in order for God to express his love and to be giving, he has to make creatures that can appreciate that. And so what he does is he makes creatures who are capable of entering into a kind of relationship with him that are in his image in order for him to be able to have this close relationship. Think about your children. They're like you in certain respects. This is why you're close to them and why you can have this intimate relationship with them. So he does that. So he creates creatures in his image. Now, his image, we know that God is majestic and amazing and incomprehensible. So anything that is like him in any respect, no matter how limited, is going to be impressive. A creature, let's say, who can enter into a loving relationship with the triune God is going to have to be an impressive creature. And therein lies the risk. The impressiveness, perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps these creatures are there is no way to make such impressive creatures without them being overly impressed with themselves. We have his image and yet we're also finite. Maybe that's just a rough combination that's going to result in some bad attitude, some pride. And so we have this, we flip things and we say, look, I'm pretty impressive. I should be on the throne. So there's that. So we become so impressed with ourselves, we rebel. Now here's where Augustine comes in. There's something, perhaps, what if that's unavoidable? In order to make creatures that can have a loving relationship, you are going to have a fall. God knew that, and he was willing to go with it, and this is part of his plan. And so he's going to end up giving himself in such a way as to make that better, as to redeem it all. And it's going to cost him perhaps an infinite amount in order to. So how loving is that? He's like, I know there's these folks they're gonna rebel, and I'm going to have to suffer a lot, but it's going to be for their good. I don't know, maybe that, Augustine calls it, O felix culpa, O happy fall. Maybe in any case, there was always going to be some sort of fall, regardless, by dint or in virtue of that sort of close relation. Now, do I know that, or do we know that? Of course not. But that's a theory. And maybe there's something to it. This is where it all comes back to Jesus and what he's done. This problem of evil and suffering needs, and this is where Christianity has answers that other folks do not. Jesus, so there's this intimate relationship between the Son and the Father from all eternity. Okay, now I'm about to talk about, I'm dancing around the doctrine of the Trinity. I'm going to step on some landmines, no doubt. And so as I describe, as I start talking about the Trinity and how the persons relate, bear with me, because anytime we open our mouths about this and try to say too much about the Trinity, we get ourselves in trouble. But, that said, God, the Father, and the Son had this intimate relationship that's far beyond anything that we can imagine. And again, notice that it's all about relationships between persons. Now, what God was willing to do is to somehow sever or damage or somehow break or hurt that relationship. So what Jesus had to go through, now his physical pain, his physical suffering, all of that, I don't want to downplay that. I mean, if you've read accounts of what the Romans could do and how, think of the Turks, well, the Romans were pretty good at causing suffering as well. So I don't want to downplay the Lord's physical suffering. That in and of itself is bad enough. But then this severing or breaking or damaging of a relationship. Think about the greatest pains in our lives would be some sort of severed relationships. That's what hurts most. That's what crushes. Jesus went through that for us. We can't even imagine it. So here's another way, why would God allow this? Well, we don't know. But he enters into our suffering. He knows what suffering is like. So there really is this empathy, there's this answer to suffering. And notice what it gets to. It all gets back to saving us. This problem of evil and the focus on Jesus, all of this, all of these talks, all of the reason we go through pain and suffering and sacrifice for our congregations and our people, and it's all because of what Jesus did to solve this problem and to bring us back. So this suffering points to our dire situation, and we can never forget that. When we're like, gosh, this is terrible. I need not wonder why it's terrible. This is a broken world. And this points us continually back to Jesus. Continually back to a person and a relationship with that person. So in the next talk, that's that feeling of hope that you had, that feeling that you just had. That was, again, that hope. He's winding down. He's about to end. In the next talk, I want to take a philosophical issue and show how the cosmos itself is ultimately personal and you can't escape it. It's not like we're living in an impersonal building, the cosmos. It's ultimately a personal household. Okay, so with that, are there any questions, any comments? Obviously, I didn't solve the problem of evil, but anything that... Yes, Daniel.
Obviously, you hedged around what you were saying about the Trinity with all these caveats. I think there has been this tendency to address the problem of evil by suggesting that in order to do something about it, change happens within the Godhead itself. So there's this severance between the Father and the Son in some sense. That creates problems for me because
Right.
Because the Trinity there isn't anything behind the Trinity. God is Trinity. So
Right.
If there's this severance between the Father and the Son, then God ceases to be who God is.
Right.
And also it doesn't help us because the kind of suffering that we need is human suffering. So it's Christ in his human nature who suffers in order to redeem us. Suffering within the Godhead, it seems to me, doesn't benefit us at all.
Well, so there's two things going on there. First, it's how do I avoid heresy? So that's the, so thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate that on film. The heresy. No, I think that. So when it comes to this notion, notice what I did. I said severance or damage. Now again, that means some sort of change. I'll just be blunt with you. When it comes to philosophy, and which is what theology, when we're talking about the Godhead, it's really, theology and philosophy are not a lot different. That's philosophical theology. I'm very, very skeptical about what we can know when it comes to, when we start talking about the Godhead and we start talking about the Trinity and what sorts of things are possible and impossible. I know that we don't know. And well, how about this? I believe that we're things are very cloudy when it comes to that. So my short answer is maybe it's a problem, but then maybe it's not. Maybe it's okay for there to be some change. Maybe there's okay for God to be somehow passive and suffer. And, there's all kinds of things. Now, I know that that's controversial, but I've studied enough philosophy to know that the limits of our knowledge, we hit them way before we think we do. So a lot of our theology and our philosophy, I feel we've gone way beyond what we can say. That's why I want to cling to Scripture so much. I'm skeptical about some of our philosophical notions. Even the more you study, I mentioned this before, when you study mathematics, what could be more certain or simpler than 2 + 2 is equal to 4? But as soon as you start probing, you start realizing your intuitions about mathematics are wrong. There are different levels, different sizes of infinity. Now, I remember when I first heard that in grad school, it was a logic course, and I remember thinking, I finally have a professor where I could say, that's wrong. I just know it. It's palpably false that there are different levels of infinity. That's like violating the law of non-contradiction. Turns out that the problem was my notion of infinity. And you can see in Cantor's set theory in the 1800s ends up entirely undermining this notion of number into mathematics. Now that's just something simple like math. But what it does is it takes this idea of what we call perfect being theology, which is a big player in our tradition. And we take, what would a perfect infinite being be like? Maybe he is like that. Maybe this does create a problem. Or maybe it doesn't. So that was the heresy part. It may be again, I don't think humans are in that great a position to know sometimes. The other thing was you're absolutely right to point out the human suffering side, and that is something that's absolutely crucial. But I think that is not the only thing that's crucial. And that's not what I'm appealing to. What I'm appealing to is not the judicial side or maybe even the empathetic side. It's this notion of God was willing, regardless, was willing to suffer, his capacity for suffering. Certainly the human capacity was, we know how much we can suffer. But then there's also this capacity for suffering that is probably far greater than what a human can take, and God was willing to do that. God was willing to accept that suffering that we would be like, you've got to be kidding me. I can't even imagine. I mean, think of the worst pain you can go through, and then that's nothing compared to perhaps. Again, notice I'm doing perfect being theology. So I think you're right. You need to have the human side. But what I'm talking about is, look at how much God loved us and was willing to suffer. Now, of course, that's not going to occur if you think that God can't change and then he doesn't suffer and he's not passive. So you're right. These are difficult issues. Yeah, Matt.
You talked about the problem of evil according to a Christian mindset, but how about from a secular worldview? Like Tim Keller in his book on suffering says that basically, he gives a broad overview of different, different views on evil and suffering throughout history. And his conclusion is that our, postmodern secular society is the least prepared, the most ill-equipped when it comes to suffering, but because it has no explanation, and Richard Dawkins would say, well, in a cold, dark universe, stuff happens, and you get to deal with it.
Right.
Can you comment?
I can, and in fact, what I'll do is I'll take the next lecture to comment I'll give you an answer that's longer than you wish.
Okay.
So in the next one, and we'll talk about in the next one the nature of evil, morality, goodness, and rightness and wrongness, and how might you account for that as a naturalist, as an atheist, and then how might a Christian account for it. Now, notice here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually bring up a problem for the Christian side as well. That's sometimes kind of, but then I'll solve it. So, all right. So I think that we'll leave it there with that.